Well, welcome everyone. My name is Daniel. I'm the curator for the Ellen Noël Art Museum. I'm also joined by Annie, who's our educator at the museum, and then Scott, who's the curator for the Public Art Museum in Reading, Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us. So today we're going to be talking about an exhibition that's currently up, is Women Artists, 4 Centuries of Creativity. Scott, can you tell us a little bit about how you put this exhibition together?
Sure. We've been thinking for maybe the last 5 years or so about the collection and about assembling different groupings by theme or by category, and the idea for an exhibition dedicated just to women artists in the collection came about. And with a little bit of research, we quickly realized that we had a really substantial number of great women artists in the collection that we wanted to share with our audience in Pennsylvania. But then we thought, it could have an afterlife as a traveling exhibit, a program that we've been sort of orchestrating maybe for about the last 10 or 11 years, putting small shows on the road. And so this seemed like a good match. We had some great artists represented, and we knew that, how these shows go. If you have a hook of a few artists whose names others recognize, but then there's obviously then the opportunity to discover artists who aren't in the canon of the greats for whatever reason, but their work is just as valuable. And I think some of those minor or lesser known artists are some of the strongest works in the show. So that part of it was really exciting for us. And then we had a few other traveling shows that had works by women artists in them. So this definitely could have been an expanded show because of that. And we also had some works, sculptures and paintings by a lot of women artists in the show as well. So it sort of represented a little bit of what was going on in trends in art history and museum exhibitions, but it also sort of spoke to us as an institution, because we started collecting art in 1912 and women were part of that collection from that very first year.
Wow.
So it was nothing out of the ordinary for us. And that part, I think, learning that about the collection was one of the most exciting things about a show like this.
So why would you think a exhibition about women artists is important?
Because I think it reminds visitors that women have contributed to the visual arts and visual culture for a very long time. I mean, the earliest work in the show is from the 17th century. And so that part of it, in those days, women's roles as artists were usually as a family member whose father or husband was also an artist, and their professional development was limited by societal norms and a patriarchal society, of course. So I think showing those the development of women and the strength of women throughout the course of history is really an important thing to convey to visitors as well. I mean, outside of the beauty or the aesthetics of the works, and the idea also that women were working in a tremendous amount of media, different types and techniques of printmaking, for example, and photography in the show. I think there's value in that as well. I mean, we're just in the moment of trying to catch up with history and filling in a lot of the blanks for women whose work I think is important to know about.
It's a beautiful show. We are loving it so much. We're so grateful that we have it here. So you were talking about lesser known artists. One of my favorite pieces, and it probably will change because the more I get to walk around and spend time, we kind of get different favorites as the exhibits are up. But I love the piece by Clara Skinner, Theater One. So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, Clara Skinner, she's one of those artists there's not much known about her career. She was born in Chicago. She went to the Art Students League in New York City, where a lot of artists of that era, the 20s and 30s, went. And she was part of the WPA, or the Works Progress Administration, the government funded underwriting of artists in the 1930s, and she created this series of woodblock prints that, as you say, are sort of elaborate and filled with details. And this one, which is the interior of a theater, you sort of get the sense that there's this sense of movement about that. There's all these curves, the curving balcony, the curve of the stage, the showgirls on stage. And the thing for me that's really fascinating is that if you look closely at the faces of most of those individuals, they're mostly women, including the performers on stage and the audience members as well. So I don't know whether Clara was saying something there or not, but the technique of woodblock print is something that had been around for a very long time, obviously since the early days, especially in places like China and the Far East, but in the Western tradition, as long as sort of the early medieval or the late medieval and early Renaissance period, with artists like Albrecht Dürer and others who embraced this. But it's basically a reductive or an intaglio process where you carve out from a block, and then what you carve out ends up being white on the paper, and what is left as surface then is inked. Pressure is applied, the paper is pulled, and you can achieve pretty extraordinary levels of detail. The print that's included by Clara is especially well inked. I've seen others at other institutions, like Dallas actually has one. The Dallas Art Museum has a sheet, but it's much less well inked than ours is. And I don't know if it had something to do with the selection of paper that she chose, but it kind of captures the essence and the spirit of that Art Deco period of entertainment and theatricality that I think you can see just by looking at that work. It's engaging. It sort of pulls you in. Those figures up on the balcony, sort of looming over that stage. It's kind of a bird's eye point of view, like you're up in the rafters.
Yeah, that's what I loved about the perspective, because you kind of feel like you're leaning over. You're maybe sitting up in a balcony.
Right. Yeah, she kind of puts you in the position of the audience, which is really an extraordinary thing to do with a work of art like that. And so, yeah, I agree. That is one of the most captivating images in the entire exhibit.
So Scott, I want to announce that Annie got her favorite piece in. One of my favorite artists that I think I saw was her name, Kathe Kollwitz, a German artist. Can you talk a little about her work? Her story seems really fascinating.
Yeah, she sort of has this very tragic story attached to her. She started as an artist in the early years of the 20th century and the late 19th century, and she went to the academy. She ended up focusing primarily on printmaking and works on paper. And she got a position, an early position as an instructor at one of the academies in Germany. So she comes out of this very sort of traditional artistic training, but she ends up marrying a doctor who cares for a lot of poor patients, and she sees all sorts of sad and tragic things in her lifetime. By the time World War I rolls around and the lead up to the war, that changes her life because her son is killed in the war, and that affects her deeply. It's amazing how an artist's biography can have such a tremendous influence on their work and their output. And so the idea of melancholy, tragedy, looking at parts of society that are on the margins, those are the subjects that she chooses. And she does it in a way that is dramatic, because the materials that she's using is this stark black and white. Some of them have very stark contrast of light and shadow to add to it, but there's this feeling of emotion that comes through. Even though she sticks to the naturalist tradition and realism and naturalism throughout her work, she's definitely influenced by European modernism. and I think she sort of stays true to what speaks to her as a subject matter. She wins all sorts of prizes throughout the course of her career. She does some illustrations based on poetry. And then sadly, in the lead up to World War II, her work is considered degenerate. She loses her position, her teaching position at the academy, and as the rise of fascism develops, she gets pushed farther and farther away from the artwork that she loves. Eventually, her grandson dies in the war, and she herself dies in 1945. Right before the peace is signed and the victory in Europe. So it's sort of this strain of sadness and tragedy throughout her work, but you can also get inspired by it. And I think that's what artwork can do. It's there to express emotion, to share human tragedy, and to share human shared experience. And I think Kollwitz is one who really excels in that area. It's poignant, it's moving, and it's sort of the subject matter really lures you in.
Awesome. I know that was like those pieces, like you were saying, like they're so heavy and so emotional.
They are.
Yeah.
They are. Yeah. And you know, she got inspired by the people that she came into contact with. She wasn't interested in, retelling mythology or talking about Greek and Roman history, or she was concerned with what she saw in her everyday experience in the world all around her. And unfortunately, during the time that she lived, it was a lot of war, a lot of tragedy, a lot of political upheaval, and a lot of sort of social economic disparities between the haves and the have-nots. And I think she was a great recorder of that time, and she's appreciated now because of that. It's not for everybody. It's not cheery. It's not cheery landscapes. It's heavy, emotional, expressive content. But I think what she's able to achieve with a few lines, in some cases, is pretty extraordinary.
Well, I think a lot of her work was destroyed too, right?
It was, yeah. There was a fire, I think, and she lost a lot of her early pieces as well, right? Yeah, just to add another dimension to the story.
Okay, so can you tell us maybe about one of your favorite pieces in the show and what that is?
Yeah, I've got a few that I really like. I think the Jane Turner Egg of the Flamingo is one of my favorites. What I love about it is, like, when you first look at it, it sort of looks like flamingo wallpaper, like there's this overall pattern. But when you really look at it, you see that each flamingo has a different pose. The texture and the variety of the surfaces of those animals, the way that they're organized in the space. There's sort of a narrative element there. You can see the egg of the flamingo in the lower portion of that. And I think that for me is one. I think the color grabbed me first. The part two that I find interesting is it was done in the mid 50s when front yard plastic pink flamingos were really a sort of all the rage, in suburban America. And so even though Jane Turner is someone who's deeply interested in biology and animals and those things, there's also this element of sort of popular culture from the 1950s that I think is folded in there too. And there's another one that I really love too, the woodblock print of the magnolia seed pod and the magnolia leaves by an artist whose name is a real mouthful. Her name is Soponisba Hergesheimer. And so the Hergesheimer is definitely, that's like Pennsylvania German for sure. But the Soponisba, which is her middle name, is because she's a member of the Peel family of artists who were among the earliest portrait artists in the colonies. And so they were based in Philadelphia. Charles Wilson Peel is one of the most famous American portrait artists. He painted George Washington, among other founding fathers in the early days of the nation. And his whole family were also artists. So he had children named Rembrandt and Raphael and Titian, and so there was a tradition in that family to name the children after well-known Old Master European artists. And so Sofonisba, which is Ella's middle name, comes from Sofonisba Anguissola, who was a woman artist of the Italian Renaissance. And so I love the fact that Ella is, she's a Peel family member. She's got this connection to this historic a woman artist who was working in Renaissance Italy and who worked for some of the most important courts of Europe. And then in her own right, I think Ella sort of strikes out on her own. She goes to the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia. She studies with William Merritt Chase and Hugh Breckenridge, some of the great art instructors of the time. And then she strikes out on her own career. But this magnolia, this detail of a magnolia leaf and the seed pod from the magnolia tree is a sort of really, it's kind of an explosion of color that you're not expecting. Because southern magnolias aren't red and orange and green and blue, the colors that she chooses for this. And I think the arbitrary use of color, but then the attention to the naturalism, those two things sort of are in a duel in this work. But it's very pleasing, and I think for me the story about Ella's history as an artist is also very interesting.
Well, I know we wanted to keep this slightly brief since like you said, I'm sure there's a lot of Zoom fatigue and everything, but thank you for viewing this Zoom meeting or curator talk. The exhibition is up until May 30th, the last day you can see it here at the museum. I think we're good. Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you, Annie. And it's concluded.
Thank you.
Thanks.